Hello, thank you for joining me again. And from most of your midterms, I could tell that the vast majority of you are listening to lectures. So thank you so much. It makes me feel like I'm not doing all of this for nothing. So I really appreciate that. In fact, even one student put on their midterm that their mom is also listening to the lectures, which that made me feel really good. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, we are continuing with Romanticism in the 19th century or the 1800s. And we've been talking about Theodore Géricault's Raft of the Medusa. And I just want to kind of review where we were yesterday. It's an important painting, so I want to make sure you really understand the significance of it. We talked about the story yesterday. It was a real story. It actually happened. It was historical. It was something that was very current at the time and very much inspired Géricault to want to use his painting talents to comment on this very, very controversial event that had occurred. We talked about how he went months and months of research, creating sketches of individual figures. Most of them were friends of Géricault's, or two of the figures were actually real survivors from the Raft of the Medusa. He created many sketches, a lot of them in watercolors, before he actually started the painting. Another water sketch, which he did. He went to hospitals and morgues and viewed people who were in the process of dying or who had already passed away. He viewed body parts, including severed heads. So he put a lot of effort into this to try to make sure he got this painting to be as realistically believable as he could. He had been inspired by this painting from this painting created by Michelangelo during the Italian Renaissance. This is called The Last Judgment, which is still on a wall in the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican in Rome, right behind the altar of the Sistine Chapel. And he was much inspired by all of the chaotic twisting and turning forms, which he then used to express himself here. He was also inspired by this work by Gros. This is Napoleon at the Pest House at Jaffa, which we talked about. Also partially based on a realistic event, but very much propagandized by Gros. And Géricault is not trying to propagandize this. So this is not idealized in any way. Here, Napoleon is meant to look better than he actually was. That's not what Géricault is trying to do. But Géricault was inspired by the corpses and the dead and the dying, especially in the foreground, which again is what he created in his Raft of the Medusa as well. Géricault had had a very traditional artistic education. So he had been taught about Greek sculpture and ancient Roman sculpture. He had been taught about Renaissance painting. He knew how to create a traditional work, and he knew that most artists worked in pyramid shapes. So he created two pyramids on the Raft of the Medusa, and you can just see the painting below here. So the first pyramid here, and the second pyramid behind. And again, if I were to kind of redraw those, the first pyramid would be here, the second pyramid here. The first pyramid is comprised pretty much of the dead and the dying. And what he does is he creates a diagonal. The raft itself is on the diagonal. You also see the forms. Many of the forms are on diagonals. The major movement is a diagonal line moving up. So this first pyramid here, as exemplified in this red pyramid here, this first pyramid here is comprised mostly of the passive, the dead and the dying. As we move up this pyramid here, we see forms becoming more and more and more energized until we reach the peak of this pyramid here with this figure here. So actually, going back to this, there are actually 3 pyramids in this work. There's this main red pyramid here, there's the purplish pyramid here, and there's also a pyramid, and I can't add this because I can't draw on this image anymore, but there's also a pyramid here. So I think you can see it better on the actual painting. There's a pyramid here. Do you see that? So this would be the apex of the pyramid going down, the bottom, back up. So there are 3 pyramids. Because again, very traditional paintings, particularly in the Renaissance, did tend to be based on that triangular shape. And we've talked about that already before. So the passive here, moving up, gaining energy until the form of this figure standing on the shoulders of other figures as he waves energetically towards a ship way off in the distance here. This person here was a real person. He was actually one of the survivors from the raft of the Medusa. His name was Jean Charles, or John Charles in English. He was a Black man from France. His family was originally from Africa, brought over to France in the slave trade. By this point, the country of France itself no longer had any slaves. However, there were still slaves in French colonies, and Géricault was an active participant in abolitionary groups. In other words, he very much wanted to abolish slavery, and he was very active and very outspoken about this idea. It's probably not historically correct that this particular man, Jean Charles, was the one who attracted the attention of the ship in the distance, but Géricault seems to have purposely put a Black man here at the very top, at the very pinnacle of that pyramid, to capture people's attentions and to bring attention to the fact that he felt very angry that France still participated in slave trade. And what slave trade was is French ships would go to Africa, they would capture African people, and while those people were not brought back to France itself to be used as slaves, they were brought to French colonies and sold off as if they were a common good, something you would buy at a store rather than a human being. So Géricault felt very angry about that and really wanted to highlight his feelings about this. They were eventually rescued, and as I mentioned yesterday, very few survivors were still left. This is fairly accurate. There are very few left on the raft of the Medusa. When this work was exhibited at the Salon of 1819, Géricault had mixed feelings. On the one hand, he figured it might not be well accepted by the critics in particular. He really hoped that it would receive some positive reception because he felt so strongly about this event. He wanted to title it The Raft of the Medusa, but he also didn't necessarily want to call attention to what it actually was, because he thought he might get really bad press for that, for people who supported the king and who were trying to cover this event up. And there was a lot of cover up for this event. So Géricault changed the name at the last minute to just Shipwreck, but no one was fooled. It was pretty clear to everyone who saw this work at the Salon that this was meant to represent the raft of the Medusa. And it was meant to highlight this really significant event that had just recently happened. Géricault kind of hoped the French king would purchase this painting. Maybe he was a little naive, but not completely so. He kind of hoped the French king would purchase his painting as a way to show the French people He realized a huge mistake had been made. He realized he probably should not have tried to cover up um, this event, and he would be making amends. He would be basically asking for forgiveness by purchasing this painting. Well, the king did not purchase the painting. The king continued to try to cover up this incident, and he refused to apologize publicly about any of this. So Géricault was very disappointed on many fronts, and he could not find anyone to purchase this painting in France. So he was really, really disappointed with all of it because he had poured so much of himself into this work with so many months and months of preparation. He had shaved his head so that he could he wouldn't be distracted by his hair, and he wouldn't be distracted by um, anything narcissistic. He wouldn't look in the mirror at himself. He would go for days on end without bathing, practically without changing his clothes. He closed himself up in his studio, refusing to go outside again for days on end because he just wanted to dedicate himself to the passion that he felt for this painting and for the event itself. So you can imagine when no one wanted to purchase it, he was heartbroken. However, interestingly, he was notified by a number of gallery owners in England that they wanted to show the work. And you might be thinking to yourself, why? Why would gallery owners in England be interested in showing this painting about a French event? But it's the fact that it shows the French government in a really bad light was exactly why people in England wanted to see this painting. France and England have notoriously not gotten along. And so this was kind of like salt in the wound that Géricault brought this work to England, and he traveled along with the painting. Gallery owners charged admission for people to come in and see the painting, and people would literally line up on the streets of British cities to try to see this work because it had received so much publicity in England. So Géricault actually made quite a bit of money off of showing his work in England. And when he came back to France, he was disappointed in the French people, but it didn't stop him from wanting to really pursue romanticism and to pursue depicting the ideas of romanticism in his works. Géricault was good friends with a doctor who worked in a hospital called Salpêtrière. It was a hospital in Paris that was known to attempt to treat people who were suffering from mental illness. They had a different name for it. They called it an insane asylum, which really bothers me because for a lot of these people, they could not help their mental illnesses. Mental illness was not as well understood then as it is now. And there were not the same medications then to treat mental illness as there are now. So it was very much looked down upon. However, Géricault was hired by a doctor at this hospital not to create paintings to poke fun at these people, but rather to document these people, to document their body language. There was no photography at the time, so it was an excellent way to create these documents so that doctors could study images of these people and try to learn from their expressions and to learn from their body language. This is probably the most famous work that Géricault created for that hospital. Again, I don't like the title of this painting. It's the title that appears in a lot of art history books. She's called the Insane Woman. It bothers me to call her that. But this woman was particularly ill. She was often nicknamed the hyena of Salpêtrière because she was a known child murderer. She would lurk around the streets of Paris and murder dozens of children. which is horrific. So she was locked up in this hospital for the rest of her life. She was heavily studied by many doctors there, trying to understand what would compel a person to kill children like this. And so Géricault was able to create this painting to document, again, her expression, the red rimmed eyes. You can see how her eyes look off to the side. She looks paranoid. Her shoulders are hunched over. She probably had schizophrenia. She probably heard voices telling her to commit these horrific murders that she did. And well, it was a terrible, terrible thing that she did. Again, Géricault's paintings were significant documents for doctors. Interestingly, Sigmund Freud would later study at this hospital. He was aware of these paintings that were hanging on the walls of these hospitals, and Freud learned a great deal at studying at this hospital, studying patients at this hospital, about what would drive a person to commit murder or other horrific and violent crimes. So it was really kind of the beginning of trying to understand what was going through people's minds. Just a year after he painted this, in 1824, Géricault was riding a horse. He had been raised riding horses. He rode horses even before he could walk. But he was riding a horse in 1824. He fell off the horse, surprisingly, and he seriously hurt his spine. He did not listen to doctor's advice. He didn't rest enough. His injury got worse, and it ended up getting infected. Unfortunately, the infection spread to the rest of his body, and Géricault tragically passed away in 1824 at the age of 33. He was incredibly young. And scholars are still brokenhearted to think what Géricault could have continued to create had he lived longer. One of Géricault's best friends was this artist, Eugene Delacroix. I'll go back to the term so that you can see the way his name is spelled. Eugene Delacroix. Again, I know that French is really difficult. Delacroix, there we go. Delacroix was friends with Géricault. They studied with the same artist, and when Géricault was painting the raft of the Medusa, he showed it to Delacroix before it was even finished, and Delacroix was so inspired. He was so impassioned by this painting by his close friend that Delacroix himself said he ran back to his own studio like a madman, so inspired by all of this, and so wanting to find a subject that he too could just dig his teeth into and really research and express as passionately as Géricault had expressed the raft of the Medusa. It didn't take long for Delacroix to find a similar subject. Delacroix painted this in 1824. This is the massacre at Chios. Again, this was also a real event. It had also happened in recent history. This happened in 1822. One of the major differences, however, is that this event did not take place in France. Rather, it took place in Greece. Greece had been a colony of the Ottoman Empire. Essentially, the region around Turkey had been a colony of the Ottoman Empire since the 1600s. And Greek people would every so often uprise and try to fight for their independence. And they were constantly and very violently put down by soldiers from the Ottoman Empire. In 1822, there was a major uprising on the Greek island of Chios, Chios, Chios. It's in the Aegean Sea. It's actually just off the coast of Turkey, but it's a Greek island. And the island had a fairly large population, over 1,000. the Greek were uprising and had a very wealthy population. They were very successful in what they did. So the uprising occurred in 1822. The soldiers from the Ottoman Empire immediately arrived and began putting down this rebellion extremely violently. In fact, about 21,000 people on the island of Chios were able to escape. 52,000 were enslaved by the Ottoman Empire. About another 52,000 were massacred, were killed by the Ottoman soldiers. Many of those who were enslaved were women and children who were thrown into slavery. They were tortured by the Ottoman people. So it was a tragic event. It was an event that didn't anger just Delacroix. It angered many people throughout throughout Europe. And many people throughout Europe tried to travel to Greece to help the Greek people gain their freedom. It was a subject that appealed to many romantic artists, including visual artists like painters and sculptors. It also appealed to very romantic poets. Lord Byron, for example, there he is. Lord Byron, who was a British poet, was also obsessed with this idea of liberty and freedom for the Greek people. In fact, he went to Greece himself. He helped to fight for the Greek people. He actually lost his life helping to fight for independence for the Greek people. So here we can see Delacroix is very inspired by Géricault. Again, it's a romantic image. We can see the looser brushstrokes. We can see the suffering of the people. And again, this is all very sublime still. A painting, a romantic painting, again, I want to stress, is not something necessarily happy or uplifting or anything to do with love or romance. Again, it's the sublime. Any really strong, passionate emotion, love, obsession, hatred, jealousy, violence, killing, torture, all very popular subjects for romanticists. Again, either visual artists, poets, writers, musicians, they were all very inspired by events like this. They were all very inspired by the drama of romanticism. We can see the diagonals represented in this work, very much inspired from the Baroque, the looser brushstrokes, all very romanticized. When this painting was hanging in Salon 1824, it was hanging right near this painting. This painting is by a British artist. His name was John Constable, and this is called The Hay Wain. We'll actually be seeing this painting and we'll be talking about Constable individually and not just in reference to Delacroix. But this painting was also hanging in the Salon of 1824, fairly near Delacroix's painting. Interestingly, and rather ironically, the French people loved this painting. They loved all British paintings like this because they were calm and beautiful, in contrast to this, which was not calm and beautiful. It was disturbing. But Delacroix saw this painting as he was putting his painting on the wall, and he was just really taken with not only the beauty of this painting, but also really up close. He loved the way Constable put colors on the canvas. And I couldn't get a specific detail of the grass in the background. I'll show you what I'm talking about. This field here, it's hard to find a specific detail of the field. This was the closest I could get. But when you get really, really close up to this painting, you realize that Constable has taken different colors of greens and browns and yellows, and he has literally created separate strokes to create that field of grass. When you see it from a distance like this, it all comes together as a field. It looks like maybe spring and the field is just coming out of its dormancy. A lot of grasses do go dormant in the colder weather, or perhaps it's the beginning of winter and it's just starting to go dormant. So the field has a lot of browns and yellows in it, patches of green as well. So it comes across, all those colors kind of merge together. But again, very close up, you can see it a little bit here. You can see individual strokes that Constable put on. Well, Delacroix was just stunned at the effect. And as this painting was hanging on the wall, oops, I thought I brought in a detail, I didn't. As this painting was hanging on the wall at the salon, Delacroix rushed back to his studio. He came back. The salon was not yet open, but he stood there in front of this painting with his paintbrushes and his paints, and he began to repaint, especially the foreground part of it, and tried to capture a similar effect of what Constable was doing. This time in browns to try to capture the earth, the dirt, rather than the green of the grass. But when you get close to this, and that's why I thought I had brought in a detail, when you get close to it, you realize there are separate strokes of different colors of browns and whites and grays. And he was trying to, again, accomplish what Constable had done. It didn't help much because the French people coming to the salon still loved this, and they still hated this. Even Gros himself, the artist Gros, hated this painting. He called it a massacre of a painting. It didn't much faze Delacroix. He was from a very wealthy family. He didn't have to be painting. He didn't have to work at all. He had that much money, but he painted because he felt he needed the passion. He needed to paint to express himself. Oh, talking about how people view the paint, completely, to mention an important aspect of this. Not only did the government not purchase this painting by Géricault, most of the art critics despised this work. One art critic, in fact, said, painting's role in our lives should be to appeal to our eyes. In other words, painting should be beautiful, and it should reach our soul. Instead, this painting, he said, is disgusting. So he said, this is not what painting is. However, there were other people who said that we are all of us on the raft of the Medusa, meaning they felt that this kind of symbolized the suffering of all humanity. So anyways, getting back to Delacroix. So this painting was not well appreciated. Again, it didn't much faze Delacroix. Again, he didn't have to be painting. He painted because he felt that great need within his soul to express himself. Like a lot of other romantic artists, he wasn't just inspired by current events. He was also inspired by the exotic, the long ago, the far away, anything that seemed different from everyday French life. This is called The Death of Sardanapalus. Now, this was a common subject, again, for a lot of romantic artists, including painters, including poets and novelists as well. Lord Byron, again pictured here, had also created a poem about the death of Sardanapalus. Lord Byron's poem ended very differently. However, Lord Byron's poem describes how King Sardanapalus, and I'll explain who King Sardanapalus sort of was, Lord Byron's poem ends with Sardanapalus and his wife dying together on their bed. That's not quite what Delacroix has created. Delacroix has created a whirling, dynamic, chaotic image of, death and violence. Sardanapalus is here. According to legend, Sardanapalus was a king from the Assyrian Empire. Now, I don't mean the Syrian Empire, I mean the Assyrian with an A in front. The Assyrians were real people. They lived in the region of what is today roughly modern day Iraq into modern day Iran. Um, they the kings tended to be very intelligent, but also very ruthless, very violent kings who had no qualms about killing people if people uprise or revolted against them. The ancient Greeks who came after the Assyrian Empire, the ancient Greeks believed that Sardanapalus, King Sardanapalus, was the last king of the Assyrian Empire. Modern scholarly research has proven that incorrect. In fact, we're pretty sure there really was not a Sardanapalus. His life, as told by several Greek historians, ancient Greek historians, his life kind of mirrors a conglomeration, a combination of a couple or maybe even three different Assyrian kings. So he was kind of a composite of different personalities, but again, there doesn't seem to be any one particular Sardanapalus king. Nevertheless, Delacroix didn't know that at this point in the early 1800s. He assumed that Sardanapalus had been a real king, and the story was that Sardanapalus was a king who loved excess. He loved to wear expensive clothing, he loved to eat expensive food, he loved to drink expensive alcohol, he liked to wear expensive jewelry. He was supposedly bisexual, he had many wives, he had many mistresses, he had concubines, some were women, some were men. He lived a life of extreme excess. Not to say that being bisexual is living in excess, but that's the way the story has come down to us. And supposedly his empire, the Assyrian Empire, was about to be overthrown by enemy troops. And the Assyrian Empire in reality was overthrown by a combination of the Babylonians with an outside tribe called the Menes, who got together and were successfully able to overthrow the Assyrians. But in any case, if Sardanapalus had been real, supposedly he was the last king, he lived in excess, he believed he had successfully put down the uprisings of the Babylonians. In reality, he had not. The Babylonians were marching towards Sardanapalus' palace. Sardanapalus got word that the Babylonians were about to set fire to his palace, and rather than be taken prisoner or die in disgrace, Sardanapalus decided that he wanted to die his own way. So, and this is where everything just gets really, really fuzzy. Lord Byron had done research, and according to his research, Sardanapalus again had taken his favorite wife, they had sat on his bed together, they had set fire to the bed, and they died that way. Delacroix went a very different direction with this violent and tumultuous composition. Sardanapalus is here, and according to some historians at the time, again, no historian would agree that any of this was true. But according to historians in the 1800s, they believed Sardanapalus had ordered his gathered all of his favorite wives, all of his favorite harem women to kill them in front of him. And he sits here watching them. This woman is being stabbed right here. Oops, she's being stabbed right there. This woman has already died. So all of his favorite people were to be killed in front of him. His favorite horse was to be killed. All of his favorite pets were to be killed. He wanted all of his favorite objects brought into his room. And after they had all been killed, he wanted them all piled on top of his bed. And then he wanted his soldiers to kill him and to set fire to his bed. And once he and all of his favorite people and things had been destroyed, then his soldiers could go out and fight to the death against the Babylonians. Again, Delacroix might have thought it was all true. None of it was true, but it doesn't hugely matter for our purpose because it's very exotic, takes place in the ancient world, very far away from France. It's a similar subject matter to what Ingres was interested in. We saw the Grande Odalisque yesterday. And the whole idea of the exotic, the peacock fan, the Turkish pipe, the fur that she's reclining on, it all seemed so different from everyday French life, as did this to Delacroix. But you can see the two artists have handled a similar subject matter in a very different way. Ingres makes all of his forms look like sculptures. He really focuses on the textures and the details of these exotic objects. Delacroix is not as interested in the details. He really just wants to create that whirlwind of action. It doesn't matter to him if any of this is accurate or not. He just likes the whole romanticized vision of the subject, of the violence, of the long ago, the far away, just really appealed to him. Anything that's not here and now appealed to Delacroix. Delacroix, on the exterior, people thought he was a wealthy guy. He went to a lot of parties. He socialized a great deal. And he came across as really outgoing, really funny. He always had the right thing to say to everybody. He was just really fun to be around. He was intelligent. He had excellent education. So he was like the perfect companion. However, Delacroix wrote 3 volumes of diaries throughout his adult life. Those diaries still exist today, and scholars have pored over them. And they've realized that all of that was a facade, that Delacroix was putting on this fake personality in public. But deep within himself, Delacroix was very pessimistic. He was depressed, and he viewed life through these very romanticized lenses. In other words, he did not like everyday life in France as it was in the early 1800s. He was frustrated with the French government, even though, interestingly, French kings and the French king and royal family members often purchased his paintings. He was frustrated with the government. He was frustrated with society. He was just frustrated with life in general. So for him, looking back to the past seemed ideal. Looking to a country fighting for independence was so different from what was happening in France at the time that this seemed appealing to him. Anything that wasn't French at the time seemed appealing to Delacroix. So it's not surprising to us that he would have painted a subject like this. It was an escape. A lot of romantic artists experimented pretty heavily with drugs, especially opium, to create an escape. So if they couldn't imagine escapes like this in their minds, they would take opium to help their minds wander. to help their minds come up with ideas that could help them escape, to create romanticized images. I'm not saying that Delacroix took opium. There's no evidence to suggest that. I just bring it up to say that Delacroix was not alone in his frustration with the status quo in France. The painting, like Géricault's Rafter of the Medusa, was not well liked, and Delacroix knew it would not be well liked. He himself called it Massacre Number 2. The critics were appalled that he had created this. They felt like it was violence and nudity just for the sake of painting violence and nudity. They thought, fine. I mean, if you're going to create nudity, create something like this, which they were starting to feel was a lot more tasteful than what Delacroix was creating. Delacroix was a younger generation from Ingres. And at the Salon of 1826, 1826, when Delacroix exhibited this, suddenly critics were looking at Ingres' works and they were saying, oh, Ingres isn't so bad after all. And they started to actually really see Ingres' works much more positively than this. And Ingres was really disappointed. He's like, oh, I'm not the rebel anymore. And suddenly that rebel status was given to Delacroix instead of to Ingres. You can definitely see the influence Delacroix studied painting Rubens from Flemish oak. It's a similar idea of the contrast of the women's skin against the muscularity of the men's. We can see that here. The contrast in textures, the drama, the theatricality, the movement, the diagonals, it's all here. It's all very Baroque inspired, which really is Romanticism in a nutshell. Romanticism is very much inspired by Rubens' Baroque style. Now, again, I want to stress Delacroix was from a wealthy family. He did not need to be painting. He did not need to be working at all. Generally, his political feelings were relatively conservative. He wasn't necessarily a supporter of the French monarchy, but nor did he feel hatred towards the French monarchy. However, in July 830, Delacroix felt like he really needed to express himself politically with this painting, Liberty Leading the People of 1830. This also was inspired by a relatively real event. This particular event did not necessarily happen. This part of Delacroix's imagination inspired something very real. In July of 1830, the king at the time, King Charles X, made it very clear that he wanted to go back to the French people thinking of him as a king with absolute power. Now, the people had really pushed for a constitution. They had pushed for an elected body called the Chamber of Deputies. It was basically like a parliament or Congress that was meant to be a system of checks and balances on the power of the king. In other words, the Chamber of Deputies were people who were elected by the people of France. They helped to pass laws, and their role was also to make sure King Charles X did not overstep his bounds, did not use too much power. Well, Charles X became very annoyed, and he wanted to be a traditional king that didn't have anyone overlooking what he could or could not do. So he disbanded the newly elected Chamber of Deputies. He made them illegal. He also decided that he wanted to censor the press, that he didn't want newspapers saying anything negative about him. Fake news, right? He didn't want any fake news written about him. He couldn't stand any criticism, and he felt like any criticism about him would incite revolution. He also began to raise taxes on the middle classes and the lower classes, and the pushback was enormous. The people in Paris were just infuriated with this. And in July of 1830, as soon as Charles X started initiating some of these laws, the people in Paris began to uprise. They created barricades in the streets. Now, if you've ever been to Paris and walked along, kind of the downtown area of Paris, like the Champs-Élysées and those other really upscale boulevards, Paris did not look like that in 1830. Paris still looked very much like a city from the Middle Ages. The streets were very narrow, very narrow. There were a lot of apartment buildings that tended to be 3 or 4 stories tall. So the streets themselves were pretty dark. There was very little air ventilation coming through. There was very little running water. And so people just tended to dump raw waste out into the streets. There was a lot of spread of disease. King Charles X did nothing to help people in Paris at this point. So in this uprising, which is considered the Second French Revolution in 1830, the first, of course, was in 1789, the second in 1830. People put up barricades. What that meant was they took garbage, they took park benches, they dragged furniture out from their apartments, and they created fences in the streets. It was very easy to do because the streets were so narrow. And then the people who lived in the neighborhoods would hide behind the barricades, and they would arm themselves with as much ammunition as they could find. And then French soldiers would march there. French soldiers would march up to the barricades and they'd be ambushed by the people who were hiding behind the barricades. And so this is the way the Second French Revolution of 1830 was staged. Eventually, after several days, the people won the revolution, far cry from the First Revolution, which in actuality lasted several years. This one lasted just a few days. And it ended with King Charles X saying, okay, you win. He abdicated, meaning he took himself off the throne. He fled France as quickly as he possibly could. And ultimately, one of his distant cousins was put on the throne instead, whose name was Louis Philippe. And we'll be talking a lot more about Louis Philippe in the coming days. But in the meantime, Delacroix saw the scenes of people uprising in the streets. He could see it from the windows of his studio as he looked down to the streets below. And he was so enraged. He was so angered at King Charles X that he thought, that's it. He's going to make a political stand. He knew he'd be heavily criticized for it. He didn't care. He wanted to create this passionate, powerful work in a romantic way to show where he stood politically with the people of France. So this is Liberty Leading the People of 1830, an important date. When I teach actually in the classroom face to face, on the midterms, I don't just have essays, I also have multiple choice questions. I also have slide IDs. So I'll show an image and you'd have to identify it. And I give reviews. So, anyways, it doesn't matter for this. But I will often show this painting and I will say, what is the date? Because it's such an important date of 1830. It was a really pivotal event of the people of France fighting for a free press, fighting for freedom of speech, fighting for a chamber of deputies who would make sure the king's power did not get out of control. So it was a very important revolution. There would end up being 3 French revolutions, and they were all very significant towards creating freedom in France. Okay, so with this painting, we see liberty. Now, liberty is an abstract idea, right? Liberty is not an object that we can hold in our hand, but Delacroix creates liberty in the form of a woman here. She is an allegory for the concept of liberty. He wants to make sure that we, the viewers, understand she's not a real woman. So he purposely makes her very tall. She towers over all of the other figures. He purposely puts her face in profile. 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 There we go. He was very inspired by ancient Roman coins, and these are both authentic Roman coins. You can see again, it blah, blah. In ancient Roman coins, they would often put important people, especially emperors or emperors' wives, in profile view on the coins. So it's meant to recall the ideas of republicanism. And what I mean by that is before Rome became an empire, Rome was a republic. Rome had a senate, literally they called it a senate, made up of elected officials. And from the senate, 2 presidents would be, and again, make sure that there was a system of checks and balances, that no one would have too much power. So the French people were very inspired by the republicanism of ancient Rome. They were also inspired by the democracy of ancient Greece, and democracy was created by the ancient Greek people in the city of Athens. So that's why he purposely puts her face in profile, to bring up those ideas of democracy and republicanism. Her dress slips down, not to sexualize her, far from it, but again, to recall ancient Greek sculptures. This is the Venus de Milo, a very famous ancient Greek sculpture. And I could go into a whole aside, and I'm not going to because we would be here way too long. But for the most part, ancient Greek sculptors actually did not show women's bodies in the nude. For the most part, most ancient Greek sculptures actually show nude male figures. So this is relatively rare, but we often think of Greek sculptures as showing nudity. So again, it's meant to recall the idea of the democracy of ancient Greece. In addition, Delacroix shows liberty. She is holding the French tricolor flag. It's the same colors as the flag of the United States. And while we would say red, white, blue, the French say blue, white, red. And the flag symbolizes freedom, liberty. So she's holding this flag to symbolize this idea. And she's surrounded by 3 male figures. Scholars heatedly disagree what these figures stand for. This one, there's general agreement over who he is meant to be. None of them are meant to be real people per se. So you can't like say, oh, this one has a particular name. They're meant to be types. So they're meant to represent certain types of people who were common in French society at the time. So this man here symbolizes the middle class. And we can tell he symbolizes the middle class based on the clothing that he's wearing, especially the top hat, the cravat, the jacket, would have been a very middle class type of outfit. The middle classes got heavily involved in the revolution of 1830, fighting in the streets alongside the lower classes. This figure here is debated. And depending on which scholar you ask, excuse me, some say he's a student. However, the most convincing arguments I've heard is that he's meant to be a factory worker. And he's wearing an apron. I don't know how well you can see it, but it's kind of the bib of his apron here. Here are the straps. He's wearing an apron. You can see it coming down over his thigh. And this would have been a very common element that factory workers would have worn to protect their clothing. Factory workers were frustrated because many of them had sold their farms in the countryside, thinking that they would come to the city and work in a factory and make their fortunes. Didn't end up being true. They realized too late that they worked very long hours in factories and they were paid very, very poorly. So the factory workers were among the first to start rebelling in July of 1830. This here is also debatable. The hat that he's wearing is a hat that was often worn by young students. It was part of a school uniform. So he may be a student, and there were students both very young and at the university level who were fighting in the streets. He may also symbolize what was often referred to as a street urchin at the time. There was a lot of poverty throughout France, especially in the larger cities like Paris, and many families had quite a few children and they could not afford to feed all of their children. So in many cases, younger little boys would be pushed out of the home and just encouraged to live on the streets and support themselves however they could. Many of these boys formed gangs and they would just run wild along the streets of Paris. They were known to be very talented pickpocketers. They were also very talented at stealing things and food from stores and restaurants. It was a huge social problem that was well documented in France at the time. So he may have been representing one of those gangs of boys, the street urchins, and they also fought very heavily in the Revolution of 1830. Many of them felt like they had nothing to live for, they had nothing to look forward to. So might as well fight for something, for some cause, and gave them an excuse to use guns, which was very appealing to a lot of these young boys. Either way, all three of these figures represent types of peoples who did fight heavily in 1830. This figure here also probably would have represented a member of the lower classes just based on the way that he's dressed. And all four of these figures trample across the dead and the dying. Again, it reminds us of the death of Sardanapalus. It reminds the Macchios. It reminds us of going back the rafter of the Medusa. Sorry, it reminds us of the pest house at Jaffa. That whole idea was definitely a link that became pretty clear to people. This is a mixture of French soldiers, like this figure here, and members of the lower classes. And the idea was these figures are marching alongside liberty across the dead and the dying, knowing that they might die too and join this pile of the dead and the dying, but knowing that others would rise up in their place. All of the figures emerge from a smoky background, suggesting they are emerging from the tyranny, the corruption of French history and moving into the light of liberty and freedom. Delacroix used mostly earth tones, browns, grays, blacks, with the exception of blue, white, and red. And you see a repetition of blue, white, and red throughout the work. Take a few seconds and look at it and try to see if you can pick out some areas where Delacroix used blue, white, and red. And I would totally have a class discussion on this if we were together. Do you see some examples? Well, there's the blue of this man's sock. There's this figure here, his red belt, his blue shirt, his red bandana. Of course, there's the flag. Even the sky has blue, white, and red in it. There's the soldier's jacket, the blue, the white, and the red. And the idea was to keep our eyes moving throughout the work. Yes, we focus most heavily on Liberty herself because she's in the center of the work. She's most highlighted. She's the largest, so we see her best. But he wanted us to sort of subconsciously see this repetition of blue, white, and red. So our eyes travel constantly throughout the work. It makes the work a lot more interesting to view rather than just seeing whatever is in the center and saying, okay, that's interesting. Next. So that was the point of what Delacroix was doing. Again, very romanticized. We feel the passion, we feel the violence, we feel the strong feelings of rebellion and fighting to the death, of patriotism, the death, the dying, the suffering. It's all there. It's all very, very just oops, far. Delacroix had no hopes that this would be purchased. However, interestingly, the new king, King Louis Philippe, did actually buy this painting. He hung it on the wall of his palace in Paris for about 5 months. And then he started to get really annoyed by this painting. It's not surprising that that would bother him. It's a very political statement, obviously. So he gave it back to Delacroix. Delacroix didn't want it. He'd painted it, he was done, he'd moved on by that point. So Delacroix gave it to his aunt Felicity. Truly, that was her name, Felicity. And she kept it and for years. Eventually, France would rid itself of all kings. And that would finally come after the Third French Revolution of 1848. At that point, the French government asked Delacroix's family if they could have the painting back. And it still hangs in the Louvre Museum today as a testament to the rebellion of 1830. Okay, that was a long lecture. I'm going to stop there. We will be continuing with Romanticism tomorrow. Great day, and thanks again for listening.